He found her talking to his lonesome cattle. The cowboy said, "They've needed you for years." Daniel Miller lived on a ranch that had been in his family for generations. It was a wide, endless stretch of land where the wind whispered through the tall grass and the sun painted the skies in orange and pink every evening. The Miller Ranch had seen hard times, like many farms and ranches in the area, but it had also seen better days. Daniel's father had worked it with care and pride, teaching him everything about cattle, fences, and seasons. But Daniel's father had passed away years ago, and the ranch had become quieter with each passing season. Daniel had never been a talkative man. Even before his father died, he preferred the company of the land and his animals to that of people. After his wife passed away suddenly, he withdrew even more. The death had left a hollow space in his life that the routine of ranching could not fill. Then, when his daughter grew older, she decided to move to another state for her education and eventually stayed there. Calls and letters became less frequent. Daniel could not blame her. Life had its own plans, and he had always known that she would need a different path. But the absence left the house and the ranch unusually quiet. Every morning, Daniel rose before dawn. The cold air in February, the warmth of June, it did not matter. He fed the cattle, checked fences, and repaired equipment. Some days were long, stretching from the first light of dawn to the faint glow of evening. He moved from task to task like a machine, focused on work and careful not to think too much about what he had lost. The ranch demanded attention. Cattle could not wait for grief or for healing. If the water trough was low or if a fence had fallen, it did not matter how he felt inside, the work had to be done. The herd had grown over the years. Some cows were old, their eyes clouded with age. Some were younger, restless and curious about the world beyond the fence. Daniel had never given them names. He had never spoken to them much. It seemed unnecessary, but over time he noticed small changes. A few calves were slower than usual. Some cows were skittish, moving nervously at the slightest sound. Daniel tried to ignore it. Ranches were never easy. There were always challenges, droughts, diseases, lost animals. Maybe it was just the land testing him, he thought. Daniel's neighbors were few and far between. The nearest town was nearly a half-hour drive, and few people visited the Miller Ranch. He saw his neighbors at the county fair or occasionally at the general store. They greeted him politely, and he returned the nod. Conversation never lasted long. He was polite but private. People had their own lives, and he had his land. That was enough. One February afternoon, Daniel rode out to the northern pasture. The wind was colder than usual, biting at his face and hands. The sky was pale blue with streaks of gray clouds promising rain in the evening. The herd was scattered, some grazing quietly, some moving nervously along the fence. Daniel checked the fences first, walking along the posts, tapping and listening. Everything seemed in order. He returned to the herd to check on the calves. They were all there. Nothing seemed wrong. Then he noticed a figure. She was standing in the middle of the pasture. At first, Daniel thought it was a mirage, the sun reflecting on the horizon, making a shape that looked like a person. But as he drew closer, he realized it was a young woman. She stood quietly among the cattle, not behind the fence, not at the edge of the field, but in the middle of it as if she belonged there. Daniel's first reaction was anger. No one came onto his land without permission. Trespassing was serious, even in rural areas. He gripped the reins tighter and rode closer. The wind carried the sound of his horse's hooves over the grass. The cows did not run. They did not panic. Instead, they moved gently around her as if they recognized her. The woman did not notice him at first. She was speaking softly, her words low but clear. He could not hear what she said, but the tone was calm, almost soothing. Some of the older cows leaned closer, their heads tilting as if listening. The calves nuzzled against her legs without fear. Daniel felt a strange unease. He had never seen anything like this. Cattle were usually cautious, sometimes aggressive, but these animals trusted her instantly. When she finally looked up, her eyes met his. There was no fear, no apology, just a gentle curiosity. Her hair fell in waves across her shoulders, catching the sunlight. Her clothes were simple, practical for ranch life, but clean and well kept. Daniel slowed his horse, unsure what to do next. "Hello," she said softly, but without hesitation. "I'm not here to take anything." "I just wanted to see them." Daniel frowned. "See them? They're my cattle. You don't come walking into someone's pasture without permission." She smiled faintly. "I know I wouldn't normally, but I've been driving past this ranch for a few weeks and I noticed something." The herd, it seemed restless, they looked lonely. Daniel shook his head. Cattle get restless, that's normal, you don't need to worry about my animals. She crouched slightly and extended her hand toward a young calf. It's not just that, you can see it in their eyes. They need attention, even if it's just a kind word or a gentle touch. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had managed this ranch alone for years. He fed them, he cared for them, he checked their health. That had always been enough. But the sight of the herd gathered calmly around this stranger, her speaking softly, her gentle touch, it unsettled him. The wind carried her voice across the pasture again. Animals, like people, feel what we feel. You've been away for a long time, even if you didn't notice. They notice it, they feel it. Daniel stared at her, unsure whether to believe her. The words stirred something inside him he had long avoided, loneliness, regret, sadness, but he didn't respond, he couldn't. Instead, he watched silently as she continued among the cattle, brushing an older cow that had a scar across her face, speaking in the same low, gentle tone. Hours passed, though Daniel barely noticed. The clouds thickened in the sky and the wind carried the scent of rain. His horse shifted nervously, yet the cattle remained calm. He had spent years caring for this herd, but never had he seen them react this way to a human, and never had he felt the quiet strength she brought into the pasture. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice low. "Why are you here?" "Because they need someone to notice them," she said, her eyes held calm understanding. "And sometimes people need someone too." Daniel's fingers tightened on the reins. He wanted to say something sharp to reclaim control, but the words stuck in his throat. There was something about her presence, gentle but firm, caring but unobtrusive, that made his anger seem unnecessary. He realized with an uncomfortable clarity that maybe he hadn't really seen his herd in years. Not really. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in orange and purple, the woman stood and smiled at him again. "I should go. I didn't mean to intrude." Daniel watched her leave, feeling a strange emptiness. The herd remained calm, quiet, almost reflective, as if they too noticed her absence. That night he sat alone in his kitchen, listening to the wind sweep across the ranch. He thought of the cattle and of her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe the herd, and maybe even he himself, had needed more than just food and water. Maybe they had needed attention, understanding, and care he had long forgotten to give. The days that followed were quiet but different. Daniel found himself checking the fences more carefully. He noticed which cow preferred the shade in the afternoon, which calf lagged behind the rest. He listened to the low hum of the herd in the evening and wondered how long he had been deaf to them. And then, almost instinctively, he thought about her, about the way she had moved among the cattle, gentle and confident, about the words she had spoken softly but clearly. He couldn't explain it, but her presence lingered in his mind like the memory of sunlight on frost-covered grass, a quiet warmth he had forgotten existed. Daniel didn't know if she would return. He didn't know if he wanted her to. But for the first time in years, he began to hope. Not for himself, not yet, not fully, but for the herd, for the land, for the quiet life he had almost given up on. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the faintest stir of connection, a reminder that even on a ranch as wide and lonely as his, life could still surprise him. Daniel did not see Claire again for several days after that first strange afternoon in the pasture. The memory of her presence, however, lingered in his mind like the warmth of sunlight he had almost forgotten existed. He found himself noticing small things about the herd he had overlooked for years. The way a calf shifted nervously at the edge of the fence. The way an older cow leaned against a post, as if waiting for something unseen. Then one morning, as the sun rose pale and soft over the horizon, Daniel saw her again. She was walking along the dirt path toward the northern pasture, carrying a small bag and a leather strap that seemed to hold a few tools. The herd immediately quieted at the sight of her, their usual low murmurs settling into gentle murmurs of calm. Daniel felt a mixture of irritation and curiosity. "What are you doing here?" he called, his voice carrying across the empty fields. She turned, smiling faintly as if she had expected him. "I came to see them," she said simply. "If that's okay." Daniel swallowed, uncertain. "I suppose you can look around," he muttered. He didn't know why he said that, but he found himself curious about what she would do. She nodded and walked slowly among the cattle. Unlike any visitor Daniel had seen, she didn't startle them, didn't rush toward any of the animals. She moved carefully, softly, like she was part of the pasture itself. She spoke to the cows in a low, melodic voice, almost like singing, and Daniel noticed the cattle leaning toward her, their ears perked, eyes calm. "What are you saying to them?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Nothing they don't already know," she replied, smiling. "I'm just reminding them that someone sees them, that they're safe." Daniel frowned. "They're always safe. They've got food, water, and shelter. That's what they need." She shook her head gently. "It's not just about food or shelter. Animals like people feel attention. They feel kindness. They feel loneliness. You've been taking care of them physically, but not emotionally. You didn't notice how quiet the pasture has been." Daniel's hands tightened on the fence post he had been leaning against. The words struck him, though he did not want to admit it. He had been so focused on feeding, checking fences, repairing tools, and keeping up with the work that he hadn't truly looked at his herd. Or at himself. I suppose that might be true," he admitted finally, though his voice was rough with stubbornness. She smiled. "It's never too late." Over the next few weeks, Claire visited twice a week, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening. She never stayed too long, but her presence became something the herd recognized immediately. The cattle would gather around her, heads bowed or nudging each other gently as if introducing themselves. The calves, especially, seemed to trust her instinctively. Daniel watched quietly at first, unsure what to do. He still rode along the fence lines, still checked the water troughs, still repaired the broken gates, but he found himself lingering at the edge of the pasture, observing her interactions. She brushed the cows' coats with soft strokes, spoke their names, or at least the names she imagined for them, and seemed to know when to leave them alone. It was a strange feeling for Daniel. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how much presence mattered. Not just his presence, but someone noticing the world around him with care. Someone noticing the life he had built and the life he had almost given up on. One afternoon, as the sun lowered in the sky and painted the pasture in golden light, Daniel walked closer than he had before. Claire was sitting on a log near a small group of calves. She was talking to them softly, describing each one's habits, how they slept, where they liked to rest. Daniel could see the animals leaning into her, their small bodies relaxed, calm. "They seem different with you," he said quietly. "They trust me," she replied. "Because I trust them, it's simple." Daniel hesitated. I don't know if I can do that." "You can," she said. "You just have to start. You don't need to say much at first. Just notice them. Just be here." Daniel swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat. He had been alone for so long, he had forgotten how to connect with anything, even the animals that depended on him. But he watched her, and he saw the difference she made. He noticed the calm in the older cows, the playfulness of the calves, the quiet strength that seemed to return to the pasture itself. After that afternoon, Daniel began to try. At first, it was awkward. He spoke to the herd in low, uncertain tones, mostly calling out for food or guiding them to water. But over time, he added small words of encouragement, soft murmurs of comfort. A calf nuzzled his hand one evening and he froze, surprised. The feeling was strange and warm. A long-lost connection began to awaken. Claire noticed. She smiled quietly from a distance, not interrupting him, letting him discover the path himself. There was no hurry, no pressure, just presence. That presence taught Daniel that care was more than feeding and fences. Care was noticing, listening, understanding. One rainy afternoon, Claire arrived with a few supplies, brushes, a bucket for water, and some small treats for the cattle. The sky was gray, clouds low and heavy. Daniel had been hesitant about her coming, worried about the rain and the slippery ground, but she moved through the pasture with ease, smiling at him. "I thought they might enjoy a little extra attention today," she said, "and so might you." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Instead, he followed her slowly, careful not to disturb the herd. Claire worked quickly and gently, brushing the coats of older cows, feeding the calves, talking softly all the while. Daniel noticed the subtle differences in behavior. A cow that had been nervous around people now relaxed. A calf that had been shy began to play in the puddles, splashing water with clumsy joy. "It's amazing," Daniel said quietly. Claire looked at him, her eyes soft. "You've done this work for years. You built this place." The animals feel that, but sometimes even work needs warmth. Even routine needs love. Daniel felt a heaviness lift from him. He realized that in his years of silence, he had not only ignored the world, he had ignored himself. The ranch had mirrored his own solitude, and now, through her, he saw the possibilities of care and attention again. Days turned into weeks. Daniel began speaking to the herd regularly, often without thinking. He learned which cows liked his touch, which calves followed him closely, which animals preferred to be left alone. The pasture became a place of calm, and Daniel began to feel a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. He and Claire never spoke of personal matters at first. There was no need. They shared a quiet understanding that grew slowly, naturally. Daniel noticed how she studied the land, the patterns of the cattle, the weather. He learned that she had grown up on a ranch before losing her family's land in a drought. She had traveled and worked with animals in different regions, helping rehabilitate neglected livestock before finding her way to his ranch. The story she carried with her was not one of complaint or bitterness. It was quiet, resilient, full of understanding. Daniel listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply observing. Her presence reminded him that life could continue even after loss. That connection could be rebuilt. That care could exist beyond work and survival. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, painting the pasture in a golden hue, Daniel stood beside Claire. They watched the herd graze quietly. The older cows rested near the fence, calves ran in playful circles, and a soft breeze carried the scent of wet grass and earth. "They trust you," Daniel said, almost as if realizing it for the first time. Claire smiled. "And you've started to notice, that's all that matters." He nodded slowly. I didn't know how much they needed me, or maybe how much I needed them." She glanced at him, her eyes gentle. "Sometimes the best care is noticing, sometimes the best healing is quiet." Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. It was not just relief or gratitude. It was connection. It was hope. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel that the world could hold beauty even after sorrow. Claire stayed until the sun fully set, the sky now a soft blend of purple and deep blue. The herd had settled, lying in small groups across the pasture. Daniel stood quietly watching them, feeling the wind on his face, hearing the gentle murmurs of the cattle as they settled in for the night. As Claire prepared to leave, she turned toward him. "They'll be here tomorrow and the next day, and you'll be here too." Daniel nodded, a small smile forming. "I'll be here." And in that moment the ranch felt alive again, not just the land, not just the herd, but Daniel himself. He understood that care was more than survival. It was presence, it was noticing, it was connection. And slowly, quietly, a new chapter began, one where the pasture was not silent, where the herd was not lonely, and where a man who had once believed in solitude began to learn the power of gentle companionship. The weeks passed, and the Miller Ranch began to feel alive again. The morning sun rose over the hills with a brilliance Daniel had almost forgotten. The herd moved with a gentle calm, calves frolicking in the grass, older cows grazing steadily, and even the shyest animals seemed more at ease. Daniel had begun to notice everything in a way he hadn't in years. The sway of the tall grass in the wind, the faint rustle of leaves in the orchard, the soft lowing of cows communicating across the pasture. He saw Claire almost every day now. Sometimes in the early morning, when the mist was still thick over the fields, she would appear quietly, walking along the fence line. Sometimes in the late afternoon, when the sun cast long shadows across the ranch, she would arrive with a small bag in her hand, tools for grooming the cattle, or sometimes simple notebooks and pencils to record their habits. Daniel did not ask how she knew so much about the animals. He didn't need to. It was enough to watch her, to see the way the herd trusted her, to see the difference she made. One crisp morning, Daniel rode out to the northern pasture as usual. The air smelled of wet earth and grass, and a soft breeze brushed his face. He saw Claire sitting on a fallen log near a small group of calves, speaking in that low, melodic voice that seemed to make the herd relax immediately. Daniel noticed how the older cows leaned slightly toward her as she ran her hands gently along their coats, as if asking them to forgive the years of neglect. "Good morning," Daniel called softly. Claire looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Daniel." "The herd has been waiting for you." Daniel raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Waiting for me?" "Yes," she said simply. "They know you're here now. They've noticed when you've been gone, just as you've noticed them now. They respond to presence. It matters to them and to you too." He frowned thoughtfully. She was right. For years, he had been doing the work mechanically, feeding the cattle, checking fences, repairing gates, but he had never truly been present. He had never truly seen them, not really. And now, watching them, he realized how much he had missed. Claire stood up and gestured toward the herd. "Go on," she said gently. "Walk among them, speak to them, see how it feels." Daniel hesitated. His voice had been quiet when he had tried before, unsure. But now he spoke slowly, almost awkwardly. "Good morning, girls," he murmured. "How are you today?" A few cows lifted their heads. A calf trotted toward him and nuzzled his hand. Daniel felt a warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in years. It was a small thing, yet it filled the silence that had settled over his life. Claire watched quietly, smiling. She didn't offer advice unless he asked. She let him discover the joy of connection himself. Daniel began to notice the little things, the way a cow's eyes sparkled in the sunlight, the soft brush of fur against his hand, the gentle lowing of the calves as they gathered near him. Over the next few days, Daniel continued this practice. He spoke to the herd while feeding them, guided them to fresh water, and even began brushing some of the calmer cows. At first, it felt awkward. He stumbled over words, unsure of what to say, and the animals sometimes seemed confused by his unfamiliar tone. But gradually, the hesitation melted away. He found himself speaking naturally, softly, with a warmth he had not known for years. One afternoon, Claire arrived with a few tools and a notebook. She knelt beside a calf that had been struggling to gain weight, speaking gently, brushing its fur and adjusting its stance. Daniel watched, fascinated by her ease and confidence. "They're healthier than you think," she said, noticing him watching. "But they respond to care in ways that are easy to miss. Observe and you'll see." Daniel leaned closer. He watched the calf's breathing, its eyes, its movements. He began to understand her words. The animals weren't just surviving. They were thriving when given attention, guidance, and calm interaction. He felt proud of them, proud of himself, and strangely grateful to Claire for showing him a way to notice again. Weeks turned into months. The herd flourished under the combined care of Daniel and Claire. The older cows walked with steadier steps, the shy calves played freely, and the pasture seemed alive with energy. Daniel had begun keeping notes of his own, recording the herd's behaviors, preferences, and habits. He discovered patterns he had never noticed before, the way certain cows reacted to the wind, the way the calves preferred certain spots near the fence, the subtle differences in the older cows' moods. One evening after the sun had set and the sky turned a soft lavender, Daniel and Claire stood together, watching the herd settle for the night. The air was crisp and calm, carrying the faint scent of grass and earth. "They seem happy," Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. Claire turned to him, her eyes reflecting the last rays of sunlight. "They are, and so are you." Daniel frowned slightly. I don't know if I am." "You are," she said softly. "You've been here, you've noticed, you've given care and attention, you've connected, that matters. That changes everything." He looked at her, unsure how to respond. Her words struck something deep inside, something he had long forgotten: hope, connection, understanding. For the first time in years, he felt as if he were part of the world again, not just a man alone on a quiet ranch. Over time, Daniel began to share more of himself with Claire. He spoke of his father, of the lessons he had learned about ranching, of the hardships he had faced alone. He spoke of his wife, her kindness, and the loss that had silenced him. He spoke of his daughter and the ache he felt from her absence. Claire listened without judgment. She offered gentle understanding, shared her own experiences without overshadowing his, and reminded him that connection could heal. Daniel began to feel a bond forming, not just with Claire, but with the land, the herd, and life itself. One afternoon, Daniel and Claire worked together to move the herd to a new pasture. The sky was clear, the air warm with the promise of spring. Daniel guided the cattle carefully, and Claire moved among them, her presence calm and reassuring. For the first time, Daniel realized that he was not doing this alone, that someone else could share the work, the responsibility, and the joy. As the herd settled in the new pasture, Daniel watched the calves play, the older cows graze peacefully, and felt a quiet contentment settle over him. He had learned to care, to notice, to connect. The ranch was no longer a lonely place. It was alive, vibrant, full of movement and life. Claire smiled at him from a distance. "You've done well," she said softly. "They trust you and they've taught you something too." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "I think they have, and you've helped me see it." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't do anything you couldn't do yourself, I just reminded you how." Daniel smiled, a small, genuine smile that had not appeared on his face in years. "Sometimes a reminder is all it takes," he said. Days continued to pass with this new rhythm. Daniel found himself looking forward to Claire's visits and to the time he spent with the herd. He no longer felt the heavy weight of isolation. The pasture hummed with life and quiet joy. The cows and calves responded to his voice, his presence, and he learned that connection was more powerful than solitude. One evening, as the sun set in fiery reds and oranges, Daniel and Claire sat on the porch of the old ranch house, watching the herd from a distance. The air was warm with the scent of grass and wildflowers. "They've changed a lot," Daniel said quietly. "They have," Claire replied. "And so have you." Daniel nodded, his eyes following a calf as it chased its own shadow across the pasture. "I didn't realize how much I had forgotten, how much I had lost in silence." Claire reached over, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "You found it again," she said, "not just the herd but yourself." Daniel looked at her, grateful. "Thank you," he whispered, "for showing me." Claire smiled, a quiet, gentle smile. "No thanks needed, you found your way." That night, Daniel went to bed with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He thought of the herd, of the pasture, of Claire, and of the quiet moments that had brought him back to life. The ranch was no longer just land and fences. It was home, it was connection, it was hope. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel slept without the weight of sorrow pressing on him. He dreamed not of loss, but of life renewed, of mornings in the pasture, evenings with the herd, and the quiet companionship that had returned to his world. The ranch had become more than a place of work. It had become a place of healing, learning, and quiet joy. And Daniel understood, finally, that true care was not just in feeding and guarding. It was in presence, in attention, in noticing what had long been overlooked. He was no longer alone. Not really. The cattle, the land, and Claire had reminded him that connection could heal. That love, even gentle and quiet, could return life to places thought silent. And Daniel knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning of something new. Spring had fully arrived on the Miller Ranch, and the land seemed to breathe again. The hills were dotted with fresh green grass, wildflowers swayed gently in the wind, and the morning sun brought warmth to every corner of the pasture. Daniel had noticed the changes not just in the herd, but in himself. Every morning he woke with a sense of purpose, a quiet excitement to see the cattle, check the fences, and feel the land beneath his boots. He no longer felt the heavy weight of solitude pressing on him. Claire continued to visit, though their roles had shifted. She was no longer a guide alone, she had become a companion. Together, they cared for the herd, checked the water troughs, and tended to the pastures. Daniel had learned more than he had thought possible about observation and patience. He began noticing small details, the way a cow's ears twitched in response to distant birds, the subtle way a calf would nudge its mother, the quiet trust that built up between them over weeks and months. One afternoon, as the sun reached its highest point, Daniel and Claire walked among the cattle, carrying buckets of feed. The calves ran ahead playfully, nudging one another and tumbling in the soft grass. The older cows followed more slowly, chewing the grass with calm contentment. Daniel reached out to brush the fur of one of the older cows, a gentle gray-eyed animal that had always been wary. She leaned into his touch without hesitation, and Daniel felt a deep sense of connection he had not experienced in years. "You've changed a lot, Daniel," Claire said softly, her eyes following him as he moved through the herd. "I think the herd changed me first," he replied, smiling faintly. "But you helped me see it." Claire shook her head. "I didn't do anything, you did all the work, you opened your heart, they responded, you responded, that's the power of noticing." Daniel laughed quietly. "I never thought I'd say it, but I enjoy this, I enjoy being here." Claire's smile was gentle, knowing, "It's good to enjoy life again." As the weeks passed, Daniel began to make small improvements to the ranch. He repaired old gates, strengthened the fences, and tended to the pasture with renewed care. The cattle responded immediately. Milk production improved, the calves grew stronger, and the older cows moved with confidence. Daniel realized that care was more than feeding. It was preparation, observation, and understanding. It was a quiet attention that spoke louder than words. One morning, Daniel's daughter called. She had been busy with work and life in another state, but she had remembered him and the ranch. They talked for a long time, sharing memories and laughter. She asked about the herd, about the ranch, and about how he was doing. For the first time in years, Daniel spoke without hesitation, without holding back the emotions he had kept locked inside. "Dad, it sounds like you've been busy," she said. I wish I could see it. I miss you. I've been learning a lot, Daniel admitted. The ranch has changed, and so have I. Maybe one day you can come see it for yourself. She smiled through the phone. I'll come as soon as I can. Daniel hung up, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been missing for years. The past months had taught him more than he could have imagined. Life was not just about work, survival, or routine. Life was connection, attention, and the willingness to open oneself to care. One late afternoon, Daniel and Claire stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the herd graze in the golden light. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers. Daniel noticed the way the cows moved together as a group, the playful energy of the calves, and the calm confidence of the older animals. The pasture was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. They look happy, Daniel said quietly, almost to himself. They are, Claire said softly, and so are you. Daniel nodded, thinking about the journey he had taken. From years of silence and solitude to weeks of careful attention and quiet companionship, he had learned that life's greatest rewards often came in the form of small, steady actions. He had learned to notice, to care, and to trust again. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Daniel realized something else. He had been lonely not just because of loss, but because he had stopped connecting with people, with the land, and with the animals that depended on him. Now all of that had returned. The ranch was alive, the herd was thriving, and his heart had reopened. One evening, after a long day in the pasture, Claire stayed a little longer than usual. They sat together on the old wooden fence, watching the sunset. The sky was a soft blend of pink, orange, and lavender. The herd was quiet now, resting in small groups across the pasture. The air was warm with the scent of grass and the gentle hum of the evening. I never expected this, Daniel said softly. I never thought I'd feel whole again. Claire looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. You found your way, you allowed yourself to notice, to care, to connect. That's why it feels whole. Daniel smiled, a quiet, genuine smile. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks needed, she replied gently. I only reminded you of what you already had. The next weeks were filled with steady work and quiet joy. Daniel taught himself to speak gently to the herd, to notice the small signs of distress, and to respond with care. He repaired old barns, planted fresh grass seeds, and watched the pastures come alive with new growth. The herd grew stronger, the calves playful and curious, and the older cows moved with confidence and calm. One morning, Daniel's daughter arrived at the ranch. She stepped out of the car, her eyes wide as she took in the rolling hills, the lush pastures, and the herd grazing calmly. Daniel stood beside her, feeling a mixture of pride and relief. It's beautiful, she said softly. Dad, it's really beautiful. Daniel smiled, watching her eyes light up. I wanted you to see it. This is what I've been learning. She walked toward the herd, her laughter ringing softly as a curious calf approached her. Daniel noticed how she interacted with the animals, just as he had begun to do. It was a full circle, connection, care, and joy returning to the ranch. Claire joined them later, quietly observing, her presence gentle and reassuring. Daniel introduced her to his daughter, and they shared stories about the herd, the ranch, and the months of transformation. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a complete sense of family, not just in blood, but in connection, understanding, and shared purpose. The ranch had become more than a place of work. It had become a place of healing, learning, and life. Daniel realized that the past, though filled with loss and solitude, had prepared him to understand the true meaning of care. He had learned to notice, to connect, and to nurture, and through that process he had found himself again. One evening, as the sun set in a golden haze, Daniel, Claire, and his daughter sat together on the porch, watching the herd settle for the night. The air was calm, carrying the scent of fresh grass and flowers. Daniel looked out across the pasture, seeing the cattle resting peacefully, the calves lying close to their mothers, and the older cows standing tall and strong. They're happy, Daniel said softly, a sense of peace in his voice. They are, Claire said quietly, and so are you. Daniel nodded, thinking of the journey that had brought him here, from years of silence and grief to weeks of careful attention, connection, and quiet companionship. The ranch was alive again. The herd thrived. His daughter was present. And he had discovered the power of noticing, the power of care, and the strength of quiet connection. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Daniel felt a deep sense of gratitude. The ranch, the herd, and the people who had returned to his life had reminded him that healing was possible, that connection mattered, and that life could be full of quiet joy and purpose. He realized that the bravest thing a person could do was not to isolate themselves in sorrow, but to open their heart, to animals, to people, and to the world. And in doing so, the world could return that care in ways more beautiful than he had ever imagined. And so the Miller Ranch flourished, the cattle thrived, the pasture was alive, and Daniel, who had once walked in silence and solitude, now walked with connection, purpose, and a heart full of quiet joy. Life had returned, not through grand gestures, but through the gentle, steady rhythm of noticing, caring, and loving again. And Daniel knew, deep in his heart, that this was the life he was meant to live, full of connection, understanding, and the quiet companionship that healed all wounds.